Peter Attia, welcome back to the show.
Thank you back for having me, Tom.
Absolutely my pleasure. Let me ask, what is it about modern life that is suddenly shortening life expectancy?
Well, I mean, I think it's an interesting question, right? Because most of what's in modern life has actually increased life expectancy. But I think what you're referring to is over the past 5 to 10 years, in the modern world, in the developed world, we've seen kind of a slight plateau. And not just a plateau, but actually a downtick for the past 5 or 6 years, even outside of COVID. So if you take COVID out of it, is it true that we are living shorter? The answer is yes, but it's a bit of a statistical issue. Here's what it is. Men who are aged 30 to 60 are dying at too high a rate, and it is now dragging down average life expectancy. So just as 300 years ago, average life expectancy was really short, a big part of the drag was that too many women and babies were dying during childbirth. And when that happens, you just drag down the whole population average. So what's happening today is too many men, call it age 20 to 60, are dying. And the most common cause of death that's increasing that are what we call deaths of despair. So that's suicides and overdoses. And that is having a significant enough drag now on average life expectancy of people in the United States. Unfortunately, I can't speak to this in other countries. I'm not as familiar with the data in Europe or Australia, but I can tell you that in the United States, that's what's happening.
Okay, yikes. That actually, oddly enough, I try to predict the answers before I ask the questions. That isn't the answer I was expecting. So suicide and overdose. Okay, so take some swags here. As somebody who's thought a lot about mental health, it was in your book. What is going on? Where are we disconnecting in the way, especially men, are living their life in modernity, which has brought us so many amazing things. But to your point, something has tipped. If you had to aggregate some of the biggest factors, what are they?
So at the risk of just disclosing that this is not an area where I consider myself an expert, so now I'm speaking hopefully less as an expert and more just as a kind of consumer of information and someone who listens to experts. I think what I would say is there's been a little bit of isolation of men. There's been a little bit of a sense that maybe men are becoming less connected to their sense of purpose, and as such, this is producing behaviors in men that are ultimately harmful, right? So one of the things that would result from everything I just said is basically a need to sort of mask pain. And in many ways, if you think about the rise in the use of opioids as an example, which is the biggest driver of what I just said a second ago. So opioid use is the biggest driver of what we call accidental poisoning or accidental overdose. And that's been by far the largest group of deaths that have risen in the entire category of accidental deaths, right? So it's not that more people are dying in car accidents, right? It's deliberate self-harm, suicide, and then unintended self-harm, which is overdose. Although you could argue that that's slow suicide, or what someone like Paul Conti has called parasuicide. So what? Yeah, meaning behaviors that are kind of adjacent to suicide. So you asked the question through the lens of modernity. I think modernity's been with us for a while. I don't know if there's something from a technology perspective that's making that worse. So, for example, we know, I think a reasonable degree of certainty that social media has some harm on mental health, and a lot has been written about its negative effect, in particular on adolescent girls, them being more susceptible maybe even than adolescent boys or men and women who are out of adolescence. But there is clearly something else that's going on with men, probably again with respect to purpose, would be my best guess, that is leading to some sort of pain that's resulting in some sort of compensatory numbing strategy that at least I think plays a partial role in this.
Let me ask a question that'll get at us the same topic, but from an angle that may be deeper into your wheelhouse. So if we were to take modern medicine, and we may need to define what I mean by that, but I'll finish the question first. If we were to take modern medicine back, say 5,000 years, And so, hey, if you're out chucking spears and getting the antelope and dragging it back, and you get an infection, we can take care of that. If we brought that apparatus, but otherwise their lifestyle did not change, do you think we would increase life expectancy beyond what it is for Gen Z right now?
Yeah, so let me make sure I understand your question. You're saying, Peter, let's take everything that modern medicine has to offer.
Medicine 2.0 specifically.
Yes, let's take medicine 2.0 back to 3000 BC, make no other change, which is a complicated thing to imagine because that also means you have to bring electricity back, and you have to, there's a lot of things you have to bring back. So but let's just play it as a thought experiment. Somehow you just transport like alien doctors and medicine back to 3000 BC. Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because going back to that point in time, our life expectancy was shy of 40. But as I said, there were largely three things that resulted in such a drag on life expectancy. The first is the one I already alluded to. So infant mortality was enormous. I don't remember exactly the numbers of like 1 out of every X number of babies, and it was a small number, like maybe 1 out of every 4 or 5 babies born, the mother and or baby die.
Jesus.
Full stop. Now, this is not that hard to believe for anybody who's watched their, if you're listening to this and you're a guy, if you've watched your wife go through childbirth, you can totally appreciate this. Like my wife would have not survived the birth of our daughter if not for modern medicine. Absolutely full stop. So we would have lost both of them for sure. So you have a huge amount of humility for what medicine has done to make childbirth safe. Secondly, you have infections. So, it was very easy to get an infection, and without any sort of antibiotic, you didn't get too many shots on goal there. And then lastly, trauma. So, you got a big cut on you, you fell, you broke a leg, you broke a hip, you're done. So those three things alone basically wiped out our species, but not to the point where we couldn't procreate. Again, enough of us were able to still pass on our genes before we died, but life expectancy was probably in the high 30s.
Right.
There were probably people who lived beyond that if they managed to escape all of those things. But we weren't dying of chronic disease. So I guess what your question is getting at is there something else in the modern world that is so toxic that despite all of the advantages of modern medicine, it's killing us? And I think the answer has to be yes, right? So is the amount of stress we're under beneficial? Probably not. It's probably a bit maladaptive for many people, especially people who are, at the high end of it, right? Stress is kind of like an inverted U-shape relationship between performance and stress. So low levels of stress are not very helpful. They don't actually, we don't have the motivation to do anything. So you have to have some stress, some drive. But for any of us, at some point that becomes really unproductive. And you start to, kind of spiral in your response to stress. You can't even multitask anymore. And sometimes that is all self-imposed, and sometimes that is imposed by the world around you, right? You have too many things in your life. You got a job, you're working 3 jobs to try to pay this, and you have this bill that's due, and all of those things are very stressful, and they're purely external. And then other times you could be in your shoes, right? Where you're an entrepreneur, you don't have to worry about paying bills, but yet you're imposing a ton of stress on yourself because of who you are and your desire to do something that is above and beyond what you're doing today. So I think modernity enables a lot of that because basically it changes what we have to optimize for. So 5,000 years ago, we were really only optimizing for a few things. We had to find shelter, we had to find food, we had to procreate, and we had to be safe. That was really it. There really wasn't a lot of self-actualization going on. At least we don't have really much evidence that it was. That probably started a little bit later on. But 5,000 years ago, it's not really clear that there was much of that going on. Certainly 10,000 years ago, I think I'd be comfortable saying there was none of that going on, or at least not enough of that it mattered. Basically, natural selection was the force that was driving us.
Yeah, that is the lens through which I look at a lot of this, is what would have been selected for. So when talking to people in a modern context, so my life is divided into entrepreneurship and mindset. So I get people that come to me with mindset stuff. And a lot of times I'm like, this is just a maladaptive response to the modern world, where the very first time this occurred to me was at Awareness Technologies, the first company that I got involved with. And I remember thinking, dude, some people just need to be chased by a lion. Like the way that they are approaching their lives is so bizarre that they're majoring in minor things. Mm-hmm. And when you don't have to worry about your survival, when you aren't looking left and right and being like, yo, I need you to keep me from getting eaten by something, you can afford to isolate, which then has all these knock-on effects, but it isn't maybe immediately apparent that this is going to be problematic. You don't have ready-made meaning and purpose, because when you have a child and you're like, yo, I have to make sure this thing lives, and everything is trying to kill it, all of a sudden you're having to manufacture this stuff. Yep. Now, I am a hyper responder to the modern world. So for me, I'm a city bather, not a forest bather. Like I love building things. I love being around a lot of people, and yet thoroughly enjoy isolation. So it's like, I am just built for this moment. However, I have these, what I can feel like are evolutionarily planted algorithms running in my brain that are saying, if you don't do these things, you're going to feel profoundly ill at ease. And so I've had to think a lot about, okay, why would I need meaning and purpose? That's the big one, right? So why would I continue to need meaning and purpose? I have all the money in the world. I never have to work again. Like, I should be on easy street. But I was the most paranoid at my most successful, because I realized, so my last day at Quest was a Monday, and my first day at Impact Theory was Tuesday, because I knew time off is not going to be the thing that I need to lean into. It's going to be meaning and purpose, and why am I doing all of this? And so having to map out what those evolutionary algorithms are that are running in my brain to keep me from making mistakes became incredibly important. So one of them, and this is the lens that I view you really affected my vision of you for sure, and how I should be thinking about health in our last episode, where you got me to stop thinking as much about diet and more about exercise. How much do you think that plays into this? How much of this is a problem with being sedentary, sitting and watching Netflix, playing video games, which you know I love, but I always want to know what's causing the break. How much of this is sedentary and just not getting after it, killing things and dragging it back?
Probably quite a bit of it, although I think there's probably a lot of things going on. So the modern world today, like if you could imagine going back in time 10,000 years and bringing one of our ancestors forward here today, ask yourself the question, what would they recognize? Like, let's go through things. So they were sitting in this room with us. So it's you, me, and one of our ancestors sitting there. So he wouldn't know what these things are that we're wearing, like clothing. Like, what are these things on your face that have glass on them? Like, what is glass? What are these lights? Like, everything in this room everything in this world would be so foreign. Can you imagine what they would think when they looked out at Los Angeles? How long would that person survive? I just don't think they could survive very long at all, despite the fact that they would have everything given to them. They wouldn't be able to eat the food. It would probably, it would taste really palatable, but like it would be very foreign to them. Like all of these things would be foreign. And yet from an evolutionary perspective, there's not much of a leap between us. So when we sit here and think about everything you said, which I agree with, by the way, which is like this idea that and I put myself in this category at the top of the list, like it's so easy to get worked up about things that don't matter. And if you frame them through the lens of survival, you would take a step back and laugh. But it's also the privilege we have to worry about stuff that isn't life and death because of the incredible society we live in. Like, that's kind of the like, if you're on the Titanic before it hits the iceberg, you can be worrying about whether they're serving lobster or steak. Like, that's a reasonable thing to worry about. Once you've hit the iceberg, like, there's only literally one thing you're thinking about. Am I going to get into a lifeboat and live, or am I going to get in the ocean and die? And so I don't think we should be too critical of the fact that we are where we are. I think what we need to do is help realign, like, how do we extract all the value from the modern world? Because I don't think you want to go back in time 5,000 years. Even if I told you you could, I just don't think you'd want to. I don't think anybody would really want to if they understood what it was like and how brutal the world was. I wouldn't want to go back in time 100 years. Think about 100 years ago, Tom. What was going on? Let's see, we were 5 years, it was a roaring 20s. So the world was looking pretty good. You're 5 years away from the Depression, which was going to...
You're also only a decade out, well, depending on how deep into the 20s, from World War I, which was god-awful.
Right. So yeah, you probably lost, right. You had this influenza pandemic that kills, 10% of the population. You've got, World War II. You're 5 years away from falling off a cliff for the next 10 to 12 years of the world's worst depression. That was less than 100 years ago. I mean, would any of us actually want to go back to that? No. So I don't have personally a lot of nostalgia for that. I tend to take the view of like, yes, there's a ton of stuff about the world today that I don't like, but I just can't believe how lucky I am. People sometimes have a hard time realizing how lucky we are in this sense. So there are about 8 billion people on Earth today. Do you know how many people came before us? So what's the total number of humans born in the last 250,000 years? That's about when our species showed up.
It's something roughly equivalent to how many people live right now at this very moment, right?
No, it's actually much more, and it's very counterintuitive. Really? It's about 100 billion people.
Whoa!
Yes.
Okay, that's 10x what I thought.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, me too. I couldn't believe this when I first learned this a few years ago. There have already been 100 billion people on this planet who have lived and died before us. And so to think, you're sitting here, I'm sitting here, we are one of the very, very lucky 8 billion people to have been born. Everybody who's listening to us right now, right out of the gate, that's a lottery ticket. Now factor in how many of us are born in the United States, Canada, Australia, Western Europe, like born into a country where you're not under, some horrible regime that's like completely taken away your rights. So go through that math. In how many countries would you like to be born into today? You've now reduced that number even more. So we really have hit the lottery to be here where we are right now. And instead, I like to think about, okay, how can I modify my current world to not be as, not have as many of the unintended consequences of modernity as are obviously going to take place if I'm not deliberate about it.
Yeah, what really blows my mind, so I'm totally with you. And as a student of history, I don't think there's any way that you could ever want to go back when you realize people were just slaughtered, put on pikes in front of the road leading up to your town. I mean, it's just crazy. Genghis Khan killed 10% of the world's population, just killed them in the most brutal fashion that you can imagine. It's just absolute insanity. And that's history.
But even go one step further, Tom. Let's say I said you can go back 500 years ago and be the king of England. Okay, so now you're the most powerful person in the world 500 years ago. How's that working out for you in your dark, dingy castle with like nappy ass food and disease and like war? Like none of it's good. None of it's good. Like we're so much better off.
No doubt. And yet deaths of despair. And so what I find so interesting is looking at all of the improvements that we've made, elongating life. Obviously, we have not fallen back to where the average age is 40, but there is something really emotionally distressing about seeing that line begin to bend down.
Yes.
And so I start asking myself, okay, what are the things that I need to do to make sure that I am not falling prey to the things that cause issues? So I'm going to lay out the things that I think are most problematic. Let me know what you think about this list. So I would have, in fact, if I'm honest, in my soul, I still think that diet is problem number one. So you said very eloquently that diet has, it is huge downside if you get it wrong, but limited upside if you get it right. So I think that we're getting that wrong. So I think that's the first problem. Number two, exercise, you have to manufacture it. And so now people just aren't doing it. Meaning and purpose, obviously you already talked about that. I think that one is huge, but somewhat ironic given that people are going to spend a lot of their time working to get money to theoretically live in this modern world, but somehow they're not taking the conscious action of attaching that to, I do this for this reason. And I think that probably has a large part to do with the dissolution of the family unit. So few people are having kids now comparatively. So that becomes a big problem. But then you also have things like industrialized farming, highly processed foods, things where it becomes almost impossible to get around things that are creating a problem for you. And so now you have to there's no default setting that just works out from a health perspective. Whereas before,
Agreed.
the default answer was you wanted to have sex, so you were going to end up having kids. You were part of a social fabric that made huge demands on you in terms of taking care of the group, taking care of your kids. So you were just sort of forced into a role that would be wildly emotionally advantageous for the average person. Of course, some people are going to hate it, but for the average person.
But let's not forget that those of our ancestors who couldn't bend to those norms were killed.
That's interesting.
Or isolated and killed, isolated and died.
From a social pressure
From a social perspective, right?
Life moves fast. You're rushing from meeting to meeting, stuck in traffic, or racing to meet project deadlines. These are the moments when nutrition ends up getting shoved into the backseat, leaving you hungry, unfocused, and reaching for, instead of something good for you, whatever is convenient. But convenience doesn't have to mean sacrificing your health. That's where Huel comes in. Huel is a complete meal designed for your busiest days. It packs 40 grams of protein, 27 essential vitamins and minerals, and it needs 0 prep time. With flavors like chocolate and vanilla, Huel is like a milkshake that's actually good for you. Over 400 million Huel meals have been consumed worldwide. Ready to fuel your busiest days? Here's an exclusive offer for Impact Theory listeners. Get 15% off with code IMPACT at Huel.com. That's Huel, Huel.com, and use code IMPACT for 15% off. In business, flying blind is a recipe for absolute catastrophic disaster. Yet, most companies are doing exactly that, making decisions based on intuition or outdated information. If that sounds familiar, let me introduce you to NetSuite by Oracle. It's like giving your company X-ray vision, letting you see every aspect of your business in real time. It puts your accounting, finances, inventory, and HR into one seamless, beautiful system. No more juggling multiple tools or guessing at the big picture. This means you make decisions based on facts, not hunches. Success in business isn't about predicting the future. It's about being ready for whatever comes. NetSuite gives you that readiness. Speaking of opportunities for the future, download the CFO's Guide to AI and Machine Learning at netsuite.com/theory. The guide is free to you at netsuite.com/theory. Again, that's netsuite.com/theory.
So I was actually talking to somebody a while ago and they asked me, why are we as humans so, like the question came up in the context of, why is it if I look at my YouTube comments and there are 2,000 good ones and 1 negative one, it's the only one I think of. And I'm sure you can relate to this. I can relate to it
for that reason, but yes.
And
totally understood.
And I said it's called negativity bias, and we're hardwired to it. It's evolutionarily very adaptive, because in that setting that you describe in our tribe, you had to be way more attuned to when you were upsetting people than when you were pleasing people. Because if you are upsetting people and you get cast out, you don't have too many days of life left. You're not going to survive on your own. Like that's sort of the human gift, is our ability to work together. So we're hardwired to accept that. And so my only point there is, like, a lot of weeding out took place during this process to get us to where we are, for good and bad.
Yeah, no doubt.
Because natural selection and evolution were optimizing for our genetic lineage, not our happiness. It's very important to understand this difference. Natural selection does not care if you're happy. Doesn't care at all. It cares how fit your genes are. That's it. Unless you're so unhappy that you will kill yourself before you can pass on your genes. That you would have a negative pressure to get that gene out. But if the answer is like, you're not happy, you're not satisfied, who cares? Can you procreate and pass on your genes? That's the only pressure that is maniacally driving evolution forward.
Yeah. And once people wrap their heads around that, it becomes a lot easier to structure their life in a way that's actually going to make sense. So given that clarity, what should somebody do that is facing that basket of goods that we just went at least through a partial piece of that? How should a guy who sees the numbers of deaths of despair skyrocketing, how do they begin to structure their life such that they deal with the biological realities and the psychological?
So one quick anecdote before we do that, and obviously we could talk about this for so long because I think that's the essence of everything. Several years ago, I interviewed an amazing doctor on my podcast. His name is Tom Catena. So he's a U.S. physician who became a missionary. So he's now a physician in Sudan, in the Nuba Mountains of Sudan, where the government is, killing its own people. So there's an area in the mountains where there's 1 million people who don't have any medical care, and he provides all the medical care to these 1 million people by himself. He now has a little bit more help. He has some nurses and stuff, and so a group of us support his work there, and he's doing incredible work. I mean, he's truly one of the most amazing human beings I've ever met, right? Very rarely would I meet somebody and think like, I'm not sure I deserve to be in this guy's presence. Like, there's such a gap between us as human beings. And one of the things I remember, Tom, when I was asking this question, I said to him, because he's going through just what the hellish life is like. I mean, to be clear, bombs are being dropped on these people routinely. So half the stuff he's doing is taking care of kids who have had their legs ripped off from shrapnel. It's just, they have holes they have to be able to jump into when the government is dropping these bombs on them and stuff like that. And I said, Tom, it sounds horrible. I mean, what is the suicide rate there? And he's like, oh, in the entire time I've been here, there's only been 1 suicide. And it was someone that we later found out had a really bad brain tumor. And we actually just wonder if it was the brain tumor that had kind of altered his behavior. And I was like, and these aren't people that are all dying in their 30s. I mean, yes, some of them do, but also many people survive into their 70s and 80s. So it's not just that you can say, well, we don't have deaths of despair because we're all dying from trauma. No, there's something else going on. And I think about that all the time, because here you have people living today who are living in a situation that is abject misery. And yet somehow it doesn't cross their minds to end their lives the way it would cross our minds. I'm sure, if I said to you, Tom, I'm gonna ship you over to Sudan for the next 10 years, yeah, or if you sent the same thing to me, I'm like, I don't know that I can do this, right? So what is that? To me, that's super interesting. And I think a lot of the things you talked about are covered, right? So even though they're eating not that much, they don't have great food, it's a very bland diet that is, lots of rice and beans, and they're eating meat that's not particularly wonderful and flavorful, and they're probably eating the same food every single day when it's available. They have the internet, but it's obviously not a huge part of their lives. Family is very important, right? So lots of kids. Family is very important to produce the food and build the shelter and all of the stuff that they survive in there. So clearly that gives them a purpose, even though in the eyes of the world, they're not building businesses, they're not building companies, they're not, quote unquote, changing the world. So purpose doesn't really have to be necessarily on a world scale. So I say that only as a foray into the question of, well, what should we do with the privilege we have now, which is amazing, to mitigate some of the downsides of it. And I honestly, I don't think it's that much of a mystery, right? I think the nutrition, sleep, exercise piece is so obvious that I think to ignore it is problematic. But I also don't know if we really need to talk about it, because is there anybody who would honestly be listening to us at this point who wouldn't agree with the notion that if you're thinking about 8 hours of sleep versus 6 hours of sleep, which one's going to produce better mental and emotional health? If you're thinking about being sedentary versus not being sedentary, if you're thinking about eating well versus not eating well, these things are really clear. Now, part of the question becomes, how do you motivate yourself to do those things? If you're starting in the low spot where it's I don't want to do these things, I'm isolating myself, I'm lonely, or I'm working too hard and I can't make the time to do these things. How do I prioritize them? I think that's a discussion worth having. I think in terms of sense of purpose, maybe that's one of the most difficult ones to manufacture. And honestly, I just don't know that, like, I don't know that I'm enough of an expert in that area. I feel fortunate that that's not something I've ever struggled with. I've always kind of felt like I know what I'm supposed to be doing. Whether
Do you
it's
have people that come into your practice that lack motivation? They've got the money.
Yeah, I think look, there are people who come into my practice who certainly struggle with the motivation for how they can look after themselves, right? So there's definitely I think it's independent of education, independent of wealth status, anything like that, that sort of intrinsic drive for self-care with respect to the sort of variables that we talked about. And again, I think that's where you kind of have to start with something that's a win. You got to give people a win, I think. And I tend to always gravitate towards exercise because I think that gives most people, maybe not everybody, but I do think that most people, when they get into a routine of exercise, really start to experience physical benefits and psychological benefits. And the physical benefits are evident, right? So when people look better, when they feel better physically, that's reinforcing. But the actual act of exercise is typically followed by a period of not necessarily euphoria, although in some people it can be, but just there's an increase in dopamine. So you're going to actually feel better transiently, and that becomes rewarding and self-reinforcing. So I always think that exercise is a great place to start building habits for people. And I also think that, if you take a person who says, well, I'm not really to take that step yet, I don't really want to exercise, Peter, what can I do? Then I think being outdoors is very important. One of the things that is pretty jarring about this world is the overabundance of symmetry and right angles and things like that. Again, going back to the example of the guy who shows up who's sitting over here from 10,000 years ago, that's something that's going to be very jarring. He's not used to having seen straight lines and right angles and perfectly symmetric things, right? He's seen sort of fractal geometry everywhere. So there's some literature on this. It's not the most robust literature because it's very difficult to study, but there are some literature that suggests that people who spend a period of time outdoors every day in nature actually experience benefits in terms of brain chemistry. So it's challenging to test because it's challenging to measure, but it's actually quite plausible and it makes a lot of sense. Again, going back to the fact that our brains are still kind of 10,000-year-old brains. An obvious example of this is our response to fear. A lot of times we still, you and I both, I'm sure, all day long, experience the midbrain fear, right? Like the amygdala-based response, the limbic system response, as opposed to the cortical response to things. And that's clearly a vestige of our evolution. Like we needed to be able to have a fear response quickly before thinking. Most of the time today, we don't need that, but certainly we needed that 10,000 years ago. And so a lot of times we still have to think about how can I nurture and feed that brain, that part of my brain that is still there.
What are the health consequences of laziness?
Well, there's obviously the physical consequence of it, right? So the body does need to have a hormetic stress. And that's true in virtually everything we do. I mean, most of the times a stressor that's temporary produces a more robust organism following the stressor. So in that sense, exercise is just one of the most remarkable examples we have of stressing the system. If you think about it, in the acute state of exercise, everything that's happening is actually taking the body out of equilibrium. So heart rate goes up, blood pressure goes up, body temperature goes up. All of those variables are actually going out of the area that the body wants to be in normally. So the body has to kind of counteract those things. And the counteracting of those things produces a response that makes the body stronger. So if a person is sedentary, and again, it's obviously easy to be sedentary in the world today. That wasn't an option for our ancestors, who, by the way, were quite sedentary when not working, right? So it's not like we exercised. We were conserving energy as much as we could, but we were still probably walking a lot and doing a lot of physical activity. Even when we sat, by the way, Like, think about it. So you and me are sitting how? Like, are we actively sitting or passively sitting?
I feel pretty passive.
Super passive, right? But how did our ancestors obviously would sit, but they would sit in a low squat. So if you've ever sat in a low squat on the floor, it's, it's still sitting, but it's very active.
So you're saying people weren't sitting on their ass? They were actually
They would sit on their
squatting?
ass, which is still way more active than sitting in this chair.
Say more?
Well,
It's
think about
more uncomfortable. I will give
super
you that.
uncomfortable, right? But why is it uncomfortable? You have to still stay somewhat active to support your body. You have to keep your back forward, right? You have to keep your hips in a certain position. Sitting on a log, sitting in just a very low squat as you're sitting over the fire, as you're cooking, as you're preparing something. Everything that they did just at a low level of activity was significantly more than what we're doing, right? This is, this chair is designed to make us as relaxed as possible, as comfortable as possible. And again, some people will take that to the level and say, look, don't sit on chairs like this. Don't sit at a chair that has a back. Just sit on a chair that only has a platform so that you are forced to engage your core to sit up. That's great. But you get the sense that you could go through life quickly realizing little things that you can do to work around that. I sit on a chair with a back, but, I also make sure I'm going to exercise, every single day so that I can sort of offset the damage that comes from, turning into a piece of Wagyu beef.
Very fair. Do you worry at all about the way that people manipulate their dopamine loops with things like pornography, Netflix, video games?
Yeah, and again, not an area of my expertise. So I come at this through the lens of a consumer of information. I've obviously talked about this on podcasts and interviewed people who are the experts on this. So I don't know if have you interviewed Anna Lemke from Stanford?
I have, yeah, a while ago, but yes.
Yeah. So look, I think it is problematic. I think I think dopamine responses to things that are unnatural tend to produce too much of a counter effect where the deprivation of dopamine following the stimulus creates more discomfort than the comfort you gained through the stimulus.
So
we'll
that one
explain
time
that
in
again.
English, yeah.
Yeah. So, well, let's start with the right way to manipulate dopamine. The right way to manipulate dopamine, again, let's go back to that idea that about like you have this idea of homeostasis is this very important part of the human body. So a lot of this stuff I'm sure you know, but maybe just to make sure listeners understand, like how tightly the body regulates every process. So temperature. So if we, assuming you're not sick right now, I'm not sick right now, we put a thermometer in our ear or on our mouth, you and I are going to be within 1 degree of each other, and we're going to be within 1 degree, we're going to be between 98 and 99 degrees Fahrenheit. That's going to be our body temperature right now. And that's going to be the case almost under any circumstance until what happens, right? If we're sick, we are going to push the envelope of that and get higher and higher, 102, 103, 104, anything beyond that, and we're in trouble, right? You go much beyond that, you're going to die. If you're outside in the cold, freezing, if you're in water and you're freezing and your temperature drops much below about 92, you're pretty much going to die. So high regulation of body temperature is an amazing power of the body. Similarly, how much we can regulate acid-base balance in the body is even more impressive than temperature, truthfully. How you can regulate glucose levels. The difference between a person who's about to die of hypoglycemia and a person with type 2 diabetes is still actually a tiny amount of glucose in the grand scheme of things. It's literally teaspoons of glucose spread across the whole body in the plasma level. So our ability to regulate every single thing is remarkable. So now if you look at the brain, dopamine is actually something that needs to be kind of regulated. And so a lot of times painful stimulants, things like exercise, cold water therapy, they create enough discomfort that the body actually increases dopamine production as a way to offset that discomfort, right? You have to give you a little bit of pleasure for that pain. And so when you remove that stimulus, you still get a little bit of the lingering dopamine, but it's not a super high spike that is unnatural. And so over time, that doesn't become problematic. Now, a lot of the things that you mentioned are kind of hijacking the system. And again, it sort of comes back to evolution. Like we didn't, have slot machines and video games and porn and Pick your favorite drug that really hijacks the system, like cocaine or something like that. And so what these things do is they're creating such a surge of dopamine, along with other hormones as well. It's a bit oversimplistic to just say dopamine, but norepinephrine, epinephrine, all these other things, that when the stimulus is removed, the drop in that dopamine is so high because as you've experienced that huge spike, your body is pulling its dopamine down, right? Again, it's homeostasis. We have this huge spike of dopamine. Well, our body is saying that's too much. We're going to make less. So less endogenous production of dopamine. Then that stimulation is gone and you're in a dopamine deficit. So one of the things that actually Anna talks about is when she encounters somebody who's dealing with this is they do, I think she calls it a dopamine fast, right? So if a person says like, I can't stop playing video games, she's like, okay, we're going to do 30 days of no video games. And this person will go through withdrawal. They will literally go through a painful withdrawal that is no different than the withdrawal that, if you remember Train Spotting, when you watch when those guys are trying to get off heroin, like how painful that was.
So you're saying there's a literal physical withdrawal period from dopamine loops, whether
That's
games,
right.
porn, whatever.
Yep. And again, you have to differentiate between, there are certain times when these withdrawal symptoms are so difficult that they actually even require other medication. That's usually not the case with something like video games, gambling, and porn. But we know, for example, it could be the case with alcohol. So if you took a person who's drinking an enormous sum of alcohol and they want to quit cold turkey, they actually have to do that stuff under medical supervision.
Is that dopamine though? I was assuming that was something else entirely.
Well, dopamine is part of it, but they actually... It's actually probably more GABA related. So those people actually end up needing to be on sort of benzodiazepines to help cope with that.
Jesus.
Yeah. Otherwise, it can actually be fatal. They can develop fatal arrhythmias if they withdraw off alcohol too much. To be clear, that is not the case for most people. So if someone's watching us and they're in a habit of drinking 2 to 3 drinks a night, you can stop that cold turkey. But I'm talking about people who are drinking a 40 of Jack every single day for breakfast. Yeah, those people need to be under medical supervision as they.
What is the benzo doing? Does that slow their heart rate? I don't understand.
Yeah, so it's probably balancing out the GABA agonism that ethanol was doing for them, because ethanol is a huge GABA agonist as well.
So basically, the body is trying to compensate for the suppressive nature of the alcohol. So you technically have this overabundance of go from blood pressure, heart rate,
catecholamines, the whole thing.
Interesting. So the body is relentlessly trying to balance the scale.
Yep.
So it's just jumping on go. And as soon as you stop the depressant, now it's going to throw you so hard.
Yeah.
That is fascinating. I never stopped to run the math on that. Okay, that's very interesting. So, all right, putting this all back in context, we're living in this modern world. It is a world of joy and abundance. And I have a fascinating relationship with this because as I've moved over into developing video games, people will come and be like, yo, bro, I thought you were about mindset. What are you doing? You're giving people a drug. And I'm like, what? My thing is, the modern world is so full of these amazing things to, like you said, go back in time. I don't want to do that. That's not interesting. So I want to have a relationship with these things, but I want a good relationship. Now, for better or worse, I did not have discipline as a young person. I'm talking into my mid-20s. So as somebody who developed discipline, learned how rules can be super beneficial, I've developed a relationship with what I'll call gamification. It's the thing that makes games fun, but I apply it not only to games, but to other areas of my life. And so I'm like, I want to see people have a good relationship with this. Now, as a father, have you thought about do you just try to deny your kids access to this stuff? Or do you have a method by which they can do all the fun things that the modern world has to offer, but do them well?
Yeah, I think being a parent today is probably a bit more challenging than being a parent 40 years ago, which is to say it might even be more challenging in 40 years, although I'm sure everybody thinks that their time is the most difficult time. So, and this is the situation. This is what I think about more than anything. So to me, this is the jugular question, right? Is what do I do to give my kids the best chance of being well-adjusted adults? Like that's the thing that actually matters, right? I'm not asking the question, what do I do to give my kids the greatest chance to be successful? Because how do you define success? Like, do I give a shit if my kids, go to the best university or get the best degrees or get the best jobs or make the most money? I don't care about any of that stuff. Like all that stuff is garbage if they are unhappy and if they're not well-adjusted human beings. So I don't actually want them to make the mistakes I made where you don't think about that and all you think about is the pursuit of success and success and success. So I want to make sure that they don't repeat my errors. And so what can I do as a parent to set them up for that? Because at the end of the day, they're going to make their own choices. So, one, I don't think that complete abstinence is the right strategy because, as my really good friend Rick Elias said to me on a podcast 5 or 6 years ago, parenting is like playing a game of tug of war that you have to lose after 18 years.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah. Now, how do you lose it? You can't let go of the rope all at once. You can't hold on to the rope for dear life. And when they're 18, just let go. Because what's going to happen? They're going to go flying. So you have to slowly lose such that by the time they head off to college or leave the house, whenever that is, they won the game, but they won it slow. And so I think about this so much with my daughter who is 16. And obviously we have a very different set of rules for her than my 10-year-old and my 7-year-old. And, so for example, it has to do with letting her make choices that I think are wrong. But, in 3 years, she's not going to live with us anymore. She's going to be able to make all the choices she wants. So it's probably better under my roof that she figures out some of these mistakes. So let's use alcohol as an example. I didn't drink in high school because I was a health nut, right? So it's nothing about like the normal things of high school. Like I didn't go to parties. If I did, I rarely went. I didn't drink. Like all I did was train. It was the only thing I did. So in a way, I can't really relate to my daughter wanting to go to parties because I was like, in my head, I'm thinking, why would you want to go to a party? You could just study and train. But that's pretty dumb. So I also realize it's pretty naive of me to say, like, go to this party, but don't have a sip of alcohol, even if everybody else is drinking. It's probably much better for me to say, what do you think about drinking? Like, what are your thoughts on it? What are you curious? You clearly watch mom and dad have a glass of wine a couple times a week. We have tons of alcohol in our house. It's not like you don't know what this stuff is, but have you seen other kids drink? Do you want to try it? Anything you want to try with us, right? Here, this is a really good glass of wine. I promise you they won't have this at the party, right? And then talk about, well, what could happen to you if you drink too much? What happens when kids drink and get in cars? So instead, we just sort of talk about all of these things because what we really want to do is get to the point where she's going to basically be able to go and make her own decision. And if her own decision is like, I'm going to have some nasty drink, I want to make sure she holds on to the drink. She never drinks anything that someone gives her. You kind of go through all the rules that you would go through for a young girl who's drinking to make sure that something catastrophic doesn't happen to her. And she also gets to know that at any time of day or night, if you need a ride, you can call us and there'll be no questions or judgment. So, that's just one example, but I'm kind of giving you how would I do that? Now, would I have that type of thinking with my boys who are younger? Not a chance in hell. We're way more restrictive with what those guys do because we're still holding onto the rope. Because if we didn't, they could kill themselves at any given day by accident.
Just because their brains are not developed and they'll do stupid shit.
Exactly. Like they're still at the point where if we're walking them to school and they're fighting, they can easily fall out onto the road and get hit by a car. So they're just like, they're still in the stage of like, they could kill themselves any given day. And you just have to decide like, okay, well, if they really want to climb that tree where that branch is going to break, and I've warned them 6 times that branch is going to break, but they don't want to listen, it's only a 3-foot fall. Okay. That's a lesson they might have to learn.
It's interesting. So I don't know if you know Brett Weinstein, but he has a fascinating rule for his kids. I hope I get this right. This is directionally correct if it's not literally correct. You can do anything that doesn't cause cervical damage or brain trauma. Like it was like these really specific things. If you're putting yourself at risk of breaking a finger or an arm or a leg, cool. But if it could damage your neck, your back, or your head, absolutely out of the question. And I was like, that actually makes a lot of sense. Now it scares the life out of me.
I just don't know how you. I mean, it's in theory a nice rule, but I don't know how you would adjudicate that in the real world. Like, is falling off a 3-foot branch likely to damage your C-spine or your skull? No, but look, theoretically it's possible, right? Like riding a bike and a scooter really, really fast, even with a helmet, you can still really cause some damage. So it's probably a nice heuristic. I'm not sure how I would put it into practice.
Yeah, it's tough because ultimately you're certainly running that calculus with your boys now about what branch you've tried to tell them, and they're gonna just keep pushing. It's interesting. That is one of the many reasons that I did not have kids. Like that is terrifying. I don't know how I survived childhood, just to be completely honest. And I was tame in the extreme. Like you, I did not drink. I didn't do drugs. I was quite literally terrified of all that stuff. And yet still, when I look back, I'm like, bro, there was one time my friend, we had these bean bags. And when my parents were gone, of course, we would run down the hall, jump off the chair, the arm of the chair, and then like do a flip or whatever onto the bean bags. And there was one time he landed like face first, and this probably isn't literally true, but this is what it seemed like at the time. His heels hit the back of his head, just to give you an idea of how far he bent.
Oh.
And I was like, he's paralyzed or dead. And then he, gets up and he's fine. But you have this moment where you're like, my life just changed in this instant because of a dumb thing that we're doing. Almost ran over a girl that I really liked, long story. But like, obviously on accident, showing off. Just crazy, crazy, crazy. It is all too easy.
I feel the same way. I feel an immense sense of gratitude for how much of a role luck has played in my life. How many stupid things I did as a young boy, as a teenager especially, was probably peak stupidity. And like how many car accidents I almost got in because I was doing something totally stupid. And by the way, it's not just that I could have died. It's how is my life different if I had killed somebody in a car? And so I just, that's you're right. That's the hardest part about being a parent is you want to protect them so much, but at the same time, that you have to let them make some mistakes or else they will never learn.
Speaking of potential mistakes, how do you think the mass adoption, I don't know the right word, of weed is going to play out over time? And do you, like when you think about your daughter, is it different between alcohol and weed, or how's that going to play out?
Yeah, so I kind of I probably don't have the popular point of view on this. So I think we need to be pretty concerned with the ubiquitous adoption of THC. I think there are a couple of things going on that are not properly being distinguished, right? So do I think that if you told me that you smoked a joint every night before you went to bed, or, whatever, in the evening or whatever, that to me is a very different situation than maybe what we talk about. So with someone who's, a fraction of your age, right? So I think we have to sort of think about this through the lens of a developing brain versus a developed brain. I think we also have to think about the mode of delivery. So what's, smoking a joint versus, a much more potent concentrated thing that you're vaping. I think, we have to think about quality control, which is like the difference between edibles in which you have no idea what you're getting sometimes, where it's like, batch to batch variability can be quite high. Things that are being basically bred to be more and more potent. So, when we look at a lot of the epidemiologic data, it's based on what marijuana looked like 20 years ago, but that's not necessarily what it looks like today. And again, it also just begs the question, like, what are we numbing, right? So what do we want people to be numbing with this experience? So I also think that there is, I think the evidence is not completely solidified yet. That I don't put it this way. Let me restate that. I don't think it's I don't think it's entirely clear that we can say that marijuana provides no gateway to other drugs, right? So if you take people on either extreme of this debate, and I don't consider myself on either side, I'm kind of more in the undecided, but I would really like more data. You have people on one side that say marijuana is a gateway drug and kids that smoke marijuana are much more likely to go on to do other hard drugs. Well, that's undeniably true. But the question is the marijuana causally related to that? That's what's not clear, right? And then people at the other end of the spectrum say, no, that's just categorically not true. And they're basically saying the causality is categorically not true. But again, we don't know this for certain. So that's the question that I would really want to understand is it's not that kids who smoke marijuana are more likely to do harder drugs later that are problematic. It's did they do that because of the marijuana or did they do the marijuana because they were more predisposed to do that other drug later on? Very important question. I've talked to my daughter about this a lot and I've said honestly, like alcohol is an absolute toxin. But I think marijuana is a slipperier slope and, I've given her all the reasons why I think it's just not worth doing until you're older.
Tell me about those reasons, because that was going to be my next question. Is there a mechanism of action that you're worried about with THC? Is it ingesting a flammable material into your lungs? Like, what's the concern?
No, I'm even taking all of that off the table because I think all of those are fair points, right? Which is, toxicity and all sorts of things. I'm thinking more through the lens of anxiety, right? And I'm thinking that, as we've all smoked pot at some point. It can be a drug that produces, obviously, a euphoria and a great feeling. It can also produce a lot of paranoia as well. And if you look at the literature on kids that smoke a lot of pot, you're seeing a much higher prevalence of anxiety. Now, of course, the question is causality. We don't know the answer. Are the kids who smoke pot more anxious because that's the reason they're smoking pot? They're smoking pot to manage their anxiety? Or is chronic use of pot associating causally with more anxiety? Actually, this is, going back to Anna Lemke. She wrote an interesting case study about this in her book about a girl who was, using ever more increasing amounts of pot, and her anxiety was getting worse and worse and worse. And basically, when Anna got her to stop smoking pot, the anxiety went away. Now, that was a difficult detox, but it became clear that it was the other way around, that the pot was actually making her more anxious. So, again, I think you have to take a nuanced approach to these things, which I know people don't want to hear, but I would just be very cautious using that in kind of a developing brain, both boys and girls. And that window of development is a bit longer in boys. And I would always just come back to the question of why, like what's the itch we're scratching here, right? Like I know, for example, when I drink alcohol, which I drink, the primary itch I'm scratching is the ritual and the taste. Like I actually don't care for any form of inebriation.
Whoa.
But I really love the taste of certain types of alcohol. Now, that said, non-alcoholic beer has become a great thing for me now because it still gives me something special to do. Because all day I'm sitting there drinking soda water, right? Like I'm drinking Topo Chico all day.
Because Topo Chico is dope.
I mean, I just love it.
That stuff is
right?
amazing. I wish it was here.
So when nighttime comes, if it's like 6 o'clock, I need something different. I just don't want to drink another Topo Chico. So sometimes I'll drink a Topo Chico where I'll put like this ghee in it, which is like this thing I really like that is like it's kind of like the skin of grapes. So it's a pretty potent little aperitif. It's called
ghee?
G-H-I-A. I have no affiliation with them, but I love it. So I'll pour that, like I'll pour, 2 ounces of that into a glass, throw a Topo Chico.
Does it have sugar?
Nope, it has no calories. It's a very bitter thing. Yeah, you're drinking so little of it that it has no calories.
Right.
Or like have a non-alcoholic beer, or I'll have a glass of wine or something like that, right? But so for me, there's part of it is the ritual. Like I like ritual, I like taste. So I always just ask people like, okay, well, if you're smoking, what are you smoking for? Oh, I need to relax. Okay, why do you need to relax? Like that's the question I want to understand. Okay, is there something else you could do to relax? And of course, people love to point out that alcohol is more toxic than pot, and it probably is on a per use basis at a high enough dose of alcohol, meaning like, 60 grams of ethanol, which is what you'd have in a bottle of wine, is undoubtedly more toxic than smoking a joint. But again, do you have to drink that much? Like, you know what I mean? You just kind of get into the dose, you get into the dose effect.
It's interesting. So my wife introduced me to marijuana. I had never tried. That was like on my list of like, reefer madness. And even though I'm too young for that, I'm old enough that I suppose I still had a sense of like, that is a hard drug. And my wife really liked it. She loves it. And I was just, I don't know. She got me to try it. Anyway, long story short, I was like, oh, this is interesting. So sometimes it will break bad and it will give almost a panic attack. And what's fascinating is the amount of control that I can exert over that I can feel it coming and I'm like, hold on, that won't be fun. And I'm just absolutely not going to tolerate that. And you can normalize it, but you can still feel it there, like trying to mess with you. Very, very interesting. But by way of like, if my wife is like, this is going to be me representing her in a way that she would not represent herself. But my wife, I think, thoroughly enjoys the manipulation of her brain chemistry. So when she's got a day off or whatever, she's going to want to play with her brain chemistry in some way. So if I said, hey, let's have a few drinks, she'd be like, cool. If I said, let's smoke some weed, she'd be like, yeah, cool. But she's going to want to do something on special occasions. And I've just found that the day after, I feel way better if we've smoked weed versus if we've had alcohol. Sure. And now, admittedly, I don't drink just to like enjoy the taste. That's why I was like, you like it for the taste. I hate everything about the way alcohol tastes, but I absolutely love the way it makes me feel. It makes me feel like I'm suppressing the urge to dance on a table. It is one of the most fun feelings ever. And if it didn't have a knock-on effect the next day, I would probably drink weekly, but it does. And so I have it a few times a year and that's that. But with weed, I'm like, I don't feel bad the next day at all. Now, I don't smoke a lot. I'm a cheap date in that sense. But the way that it has been embraced by culture worries me. Now, maybe I'm being overly paranoid, but it just seems impossible when you hear like how much people smoke, some people, but the people that are very popular. I'm just thinking of people that talk about it in typically songs, right? That it's just like morning, noon, and night. I'm high all the time. And I'm like, I am paranoid. I'm the guy that I try not to take anything daily. I only drink things that we've been drinking for thousands of years. I just have a paranoia about ingesting exogenous substances regularly.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that that's my concern. I think that it's more, you hit on something a moment ago that I think not enough people probably understand, which is the lack of reproducibility of the response is also a little bit alarming.
What do you mean?
It's really nice when you ingest a molecule and it always produces the same response. When the response is predictable, that's desirable. What's not desirable is I'll do the same input 5 times and I get 3 different responses. That's not necessarily desirable, especially if any of those responses are unfavorable.
And you're saying weed has that variability?
Yeah, I mean, just think about, like you described it, like you sometimes can take it and you end up kind of going down that more paranoid path. Now, the fact that you can kind of rescue it is great. Not everybody can. I think the same is true with psychedelics. And I'm not here to say psychedelics are good or bad. I think they're very interesting tools, but it's like riding a lion. I mean, it's so the difference between taking sort of, regular standard pharmacology and taking psychedelics is pretty significant in dose response and lack of predictability, and just, sort of the way in which they work, right? They're a much bigger punch. So you have to sort of be ready to kind of roll with those punches.
Yeah,
and accept the fact that sometimes more harm is done than good.
Yeah, that is a very interesting question. The developing brain versus developed, that is fascinating. Given if you have a history of psychosis in your family, don't do weed. That always scared me.
Yep.
In terms of what the actual effect that it's having on the brain is.
And I would extend that to not just, I wouldn't do weed, I wouldn't do psychedelics if that's the situation. Certainly not at a young age.
That tells me that there's something fragile about the psyche, which I will define as stable sense of self.
Yeah, I don't know what a great definition is for psyche. That's one of those things where it's like, when it's rattled, you know what it is, but it's hard to exactly define.
Yeah. I'm going to try because this feels interesting as a thread. So to your point about variability of response to something, feels a lot in the way of interpretation. So I was actually listening to an episode that you did with Elaine Norton. He was talking about anxiety, something unfortunately I know up close and personal. And he was saying it was a big breakthrough for him to recontextualize. Nothing about the physiological stimulus needed to change for him to change his relationship with it. He just had to tell himself, oh, this means that I'm focused and I'm ready and this is a good thing. And this is engaging my brain and making sure I take this seriously and I'm going to move forward. And he said that just completely changed his sense of what anxiety was. So that is, and it's very similar to what I do when either I feel anxiety coming on or like when I've smoked and I can feel it, that the panic attack trying to become the thing that's hijacking my brain. So the way that I think of these things is this is a means of processing data. It's an interpretation of a stimulus. And the way that I will often change my psychological interpretation of the stimulus, and this is what I'm trying to get to, psyche. That to me is psyche. It is my sense of what I call the overwatch mechanism or my sense of self. That there feels like, I know this isn't true, but it feels like there is a part of my being that exists above whatever physiological state I'm in. So there is a watcher that sees me being drunk. There is a watcher that sees me being high. Again, I know that's not accurate, but that's how it feels. Now that watcher can send a signal, and the signal I almost always send is don't be a pussy. And so I'll just tell myself, like knock it off. You're not gonna let yourself be paranoid. Stop that. I once had a vagal response to getting a bunch of injections in my wrist. And I didn't know it was a vagal response the first time it happened. So the second time it happened, and the guy was like, basically you're just being weak. I was like, hold on. And because I now had a new context for the same thing, I just told myself, absolutely not. Like you don't get, because it felt like I was about to black out. I was like, 100% not. Like this is not a physiological thing. This is a psychological thing. That to me, that overwatch mechanism, however badly I just explained it, is psyche. It is the ability to interpret what is happening to you rather than be swept up by it.
Yeah.
And so if you are swept away by, I just smoked weed and I'm feeling paranoid and now I'm having a full-blown panic attack and I cannot get above it, that's a problem. Now, the one I have struggled with is...
By the way, I think that's actually a really interesting idea, Tom. I think that's pretty cool. I'm going to continue to think about that through the lens of how I imagine the relationship we have to mind-altering substances. For me, just like I never drink to the point of even remotely getting I've had too many if I even start to notice it. Now, I also have a very high tolerance to alcohol. So if I have 2 glasses of wine, like I feel literally nothing. There is not even a semblance of a buzz that I would feel.
Wow.
But that's an interesting point, right? Is when you get to the point where that third eye of yours is not able to see what's going on. Yeah, I would argue that that's not a place you ever want to be.
Agreed.
Regardless of substance.
Agreed. The only time that I cannot extract myself from it is if my anxiety runs wild. Now, there is one thing that I've managed to peg that I'm like, this causes anxiety. And this makes me so sad because I love these so much. But Diet Monster. Now, I ran this experiment. So for a long...
And Monster is taurine, caffeine. What's the substance?
Yep. Those are the 2 that I could tell you offhand. What all the other ones, it's just long.
But is that different? Like, I don't drink energy drinks particularly, but is that different than Red Bull? Is that different than all the other?
Monster is the only one that I enjoy enough that I've drank so many of them that
so
it causes a problem.
the taste of it is good enough that you can drink the can
100%.
And therefore hit that critical dose of whatever's in it.
Yes. And I don't feel it on the day. I feel it the next day. So it's it took me a long time to realize what it was, but I went through a period where admittedly I was under so much stress that I actually thought I actually have a reason to be anxious. And then I was like, but there was one time I turned left instead of right and I had this massive spike of anxiety and it was literally just to exit a parking garage. And so I was like, that's when I realized, this is generalized anxiety because there's no reason I should be anxious.
Yeah.
And so that put me on the path to, okay, there's something I've either allowed my anxiety to hardwire itself so deeply in my brain that now I'm interpreting stimuli in a way that just doesn't make any sense. Because I always ask myself, what advice would you give if somebody came to you with this? And I was just like, I would tell somebody this is your diet. just because you are helping slowly maybe break me of this, but I just come from a place of anything bad in your life, your cat just died, it's your diet. Like I have such a knee-jerk reaction, especially given my family history. And so I was like, what are you consuming a lot of? Stop consuming it and see what happens. And I was like, well, I drink a hell of a lot of Monster. And I was
How many
drinking
of these would you
3 a
drink?
day, the big ones. And they were amazing. I love them so much. But I just cut them out and it went away. And I was like, wow. And then I literally recently.
What's interesting to me, Tom, in that story is not that you had that response. It's that you didn't have that response on the day of, and it was the day after. That's actually kind of interesting.
Interesting, and it makes it really hard to steer by, especially because I have a shockingly poor ability to recognize patterns. So that was hard. That took me a while, and it was really just whittling things down. Of like, I know what I'm consuming a lot of, and yeah, finally cutting that one out, because again, I would cut it out, but nothing would change on the day. So I thought, okay, well, it wasn't that. And then once I was like, leave it out for 3 weeks and see what happens. And then that was when I was like, whoa, I really think this is. And then I tried reintroducing it and it came back. So I was like, wow, there's just no way around that, because I love them. So I would keep them if I could, but alas.
Can you imagine if we had our little cave friend here and we gave him some Monsters?
Jesus, man. So you
got to play this game sometimes. I love playing this game. You go back in time, little time machine, 10,000 years ago, you bring one of our ancestors forward, assume he can speak our language. We'll give him that. Just imagine.
What do you give him, and how much does he stroke out over the things that he sees?
Think about him. Like the next time you're sitting in traffic annoyed, just imagine he's sitting in the passenger seat.
Yeah.
Like, how are you explaining this thing to him that he is sitting in?
That's crazy. It's crazy. And that's what makes me want to save the modern world. I am absolutely here for it. I'm here for flying cars. I'm here for going to Mars. I am certainly here for virtual worlds that you can explore that have more depth than the real world. But I also want to recognize that there's a biological reality to be faced about what we do. Speaking of that, what do you think is a thing that we think of as wisdom right now for health, longevity, that we're going to cringe at in 5 to 10 years?
We're in the process of doing this, but it's interesting. I was just talking with your wife before we started today, and we were talking a little bit about menopausal care. So I think we're in the process of making this transition. But if you asked me this question 5 years ago, I would have said 100% the denial of HRT for women, right? So this idea that women should suffer their way through menopause and they should never be given hormones, like, there's still a lot of doctors who believe that. And I hope that in 5 years, we look back at that as just about the way we would now look back at how they did surgery in the 1880s without anesthetic.
Whoa.
Like, Tom, how do you feel about having an amputation where I'm just going to give you a piece of leather to bite on? Jesus. Sign me up, right? Well,
I can imagine.
That's pretty savage. And I hope that in 5 years we have that view of, if you have a woman who wants HRT and you deny it to her, that's, in my mind, that's that level of savage.
And the reason right now that they deny it is they worry it increases cancer risk?
Yeah, we still have this kind of demonization of estrogen and this belief that HRT causes breast cancer, which, again, the data are really clear on this, that HRT does not cause breast cancer. And even if there's a tiny, tiny subset of women who are going to see a slight increase in the risk of getting breast cancer, there's no increase in the risk of mortality from breast cancer. And even that risk of the increase of breast cancer is almost assuredly due to a formulation of synthetic progestins that were used years ago that aren't used today. So in its current form, it's just there's just no evidence that this is happening. In fact, the evidence is probably a little bit the opposite. So that would be something I would change. As far as like on the more fringe side, I don't know if in 5 years, this is one of those things you can't prove a negative, but I'm pretty skeptical of the mass use of stem cells. So I think there's probably some utility to stem cells in certain situations. But when you look at the ubiquity of which stem cells are proposed as the solution for everything, intravenous stem cells, exosomes, all of these things, like the total lack of data supporting any of this stuff. And I just have a hard time believing it. So there's clearly indications where I think stem cells could be beneficial. My hope is that it gets studied so that we could understand how to standardize stem cells and how to, use them correctly, like make a drug out of it, right? So you have to, like, if you want to get a drug approved by the FDA, you have to be able to demonstrate that you can produce the drug the same every time under GMP conditions. If you can't do that, you can't have a drug. Like, what are we, we're in the Wild West here. So, like, we have to be able to do the same thing with stem cells. So my belief is if we did that with stem cells, we would probably find a handful of things for which it works, and it would be a pretty narrow indication, and a whole bunch of things for which it's total malarkey, and we should just stop stealing people's money.
Well, that makes me sad, Peter. I would really like to think that there is a magic cure-all. Speaking of magic cure-alls for aging, so the last time that you and I met, you said you were on the cusp of thinking maybe testosterone replacement therapy might be a thing you wanted to do. Have you done it?
Yeah. So over the winter, I just continued to watch my testosterone levels go down and down and down. And so, about 6 months ago, I started HCG.
What's that?
So HCG is, it's a hormone that mimics luteinizing hormone. So our pituitary gland makes two hormones, luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. They tell the testes to make testosterone. So the first question I had, which is, again, this is a question we would ask with our patients, right? If you have really low testosterone, is it primary or is it secondary? Is it low because the testes can't make anymore? Or is it low because the pituitary gland is not making the signal to do that? So one way to test that is to actually take HCG. And if you take HCG and your testosterone goes up, then you know that the problem wasn't that you couldn't make it. The problem is that you're not getting the right signal for whatever reason. So in my case, it turned out that it worked. So when I took HCG, which is, a small peptide that you take, so you do an, sub-Q injection a couple times a week, my testosterone got to normal. And that obviously tells me that the reason I've had a couple of years of super low testosterone is something in my pituitary. And given that virtually everything I think I'm managing well, the one thing that I would point to is probably stress. I would say probably, stress is the one thing, because, my sleep is actually pretty good. I don't tend to struggle with sleep. By all the means that I track it, it's really something that I've optimized. Not perfect every night, of course, but on balance, it's not a chronic issue. Whereas for many people, poor sleep is the cause of central hypogonadism, which is the technical term for that. So yeah, I'm walking around with normal testosterone now.
Now,
Loving
is that where you would start any guy that has low testosterone? Is that the first thing you test, or?
It's not necessarily. Every case is a little bit different, but that would be a discussion, which is, where, for me, again, it doesn't really matter. I could take testosterone as well because I'm not planning to have kids and all the things that would come my way if I stopped making my own testosterone, which is what would happen if you took exogenous testosterone for a few years. You would stop making your own testosterone. That's not actually a concern for someone my age. But I don't know, for whatever reason, just psychologically, it was a little bit of an easier pill to swallow to start with this kind of indirect way.
Now, would HCG pop you for doping?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, it would still be a WADA banned drug.
Got it. Okay, very interesting. What do you consider normal for testosterone for guys?
Well, it's a bit complicated because, I can give you obviously the percentiles, right? So for, a guy my age, and by the way, I don't even think normal is what we want to aspire to. I think we'd want to aspire to be top quartile, right? If you're going to bother treating somebody, you should at least take them to the sort of top quartile. So, I just wanted to see my total T above 800 and my free T, kind of above 16.
Wow, you got your total T over 800 with HCG?
Yeah, starting with a T of 300.
Wow.
Yeah. Or maybe 275. Pretty low total T. Maybe 275 with a free T of about 5. And then went to a total T of about 800 and a free T of, Actually, the first time I took it, I overcooked it a little bit. I was more sensitive to the HCG. I ended up going to like 1200 total T with a free T of 22.
Hey.
So I backed it down, and now I think I walk around at probably about 800 with a free T of 15-ish.
Does it
15,
feel
16.
different?
It does. I definitely
what
feel
way?
better. I would say the two areas where I've noticed the biggest difference is I genuinely just feel better, like from a mood perspective. And secondly, I'm definitely stronger in the gym.
What about sex drive?
Was never an issue before, so that wasn't like, despite my low T, I didn't really struggle for libido.
It's interesting. So when I was in my, call it early to mid 20s, my poor wife, the friction burns, but as I've gotten older, I've hit a more reasonable pace. But I've always wondered if I started doing some sort of testosterone replacement therapy, would I go back to my poor wife suffering, or does this stay somewhat balanced? Like, how does that
Probably
play
depends on how high your levels go.
How high the testosterone levels
Depends it would depend a little bit on how high you are now. And here's the part about this that's a little bit complicated. What we can't measure is the thing that matters most. So your testosterone and your free testosterone are just proxies for what we most care about. What we most care about is how many molecules of testosterone are binding to your androgen receptors. So it's androgen receptor saturation that is the variable of interest. So if a guy has symptoms and his androgen receptors are not saturated, that's the guy you want to be replacing. Conversely, if a guy has no symptoms, or if a guy has symptoms but his androgen receptors are fully saturated, you need to look for something else. And we don't have a test that measures that. So the way testosterone works, of course, is testosterone comes into the cell, binds to the androgen receptor, and then that testosterone androgen receptor complex is what goes into the nucleus, and it binds as a transcription factor that increases gene transcription. So all of those things are happening in a favorable way if you have a sufficient amount of that. But if you don't, that's where you're deficient. So when people have really low T, we just kind of make the assumption that, hey, they probably have not saturated their androgen receptors. Where it gets a bit complicated is when guys have like a T of 700, a free T of 10, and they have symptoms. And at the end of the day, I just think sometimes you just try it empirically. You just say, well, if we boost you such that your free T goes from 10 to 20 and you don't feel a difference, this is not a T problem. You shouldn't be on T.
Now, testosterone, from what I've read, is dropping like crazy. Men are at, across averages, all-time lows. What's happening? Should they be on HCG? I'm guessing the answer is no, that there are plenty of things they can do before they get there.
Well, we think that the most common reason for that trend, and it is a pretty significant trend. So for context, I think the average 30-year-old today has about the same level of testosterone as the average 50-year-old 30 years ago.
God.
Yeah. So that's pretty clear. We actually looked those data up. And the best explanation for it, honestly, is increasing body fat. It's just that men have more body fat today than they did 30 or 40 years ago. And so body fat is doing two things to lower testosterone. The first is it's increasing the aromatization of testosterone. So you're making more estrogen from your testosterone. Estrogen is very important. You want to actually make estrogen, but it needs to be in the balance, right? So if you're making more estrogen than you should, you're depriving yourself of the substrate, testosterone, that you want. And then the second thing is more body fat is going to be accompanied by other metabolic changes that are going to lead to more like more sex hormone binding globulin, kind of like less available testosterone. So you're going to make less testosterone, you're going to utilize less testosterone because of more being aromatized. And so that's probably the single biggest driver of what is obviously happening, which is a trend towards lower and lower testosterone in men today for a given age.
So the fat itself is sending out a signal that's causing the body to react differently to testosterone.
Well, so fat is inflammatory, right? So the more inflammation you have, the more metabolic disease you have, the more that process of making testosterone is going to get interrupted. So something in that hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis is being disrupted that's producing less testosterone. So you're going to make less testosterone. The testosterone you make, you're going to put more of it into estradiol. So it's kind of like a double whammy.
All right. At what number do you want to see men looking at their testosterone? Like what number is too low? And is that entirely tied to age?
Well, it's highly correlated with age. So we, and I think I know we've written about this where we've got, like, we kind of go through the tables. So by decade, what are the percentiles? So you can, somewhere on our site lives this table where you can see by decade of life, this would be bottom 25%, second quartile, third quartile, top quartile. So very predictable age response. Again, I think that it would always be desirable to be in the top quartile for your age bracket, which by definition means 3/4 of men are below that.
Now, why not push a 60-year-old into a 25-year-old top quartile?
Well, there are side effects of testosterone. So you have to be kind of mindful of those side effects, right? So one of the side effects of testosterone is you're going to make more DHT. So dihydrotestosterone is a hormone that is more potent than testosterone. So it's an even more potent binder of the androgen receptor. And it does some really good things, but it also does some undesirable things. So one of the things it does is it's going to accelerate hair loss. So if a guy is particularly concerned with androgenic hair loss, that's going to increase. It also increases the size of the prostate gland. And so when a guy is 60, his prostate gland is already kind of getting big enough on its own. So we don't really need to put too much more fuel on that fire. Now, of course, there are ways around that because you can take a drug that blocks the conversion of testosterone to DHT. And of course, many men do this. So drugs like finasteride and dutasteride, which are commonly used either for hair loss or...
I was going to say.
Yeah, so Propecia would be the hair loss version of finasteride.
Doesn't finasteride, though, have like potentially huge sexual consequences?
Yes. So some men have really nasty side effects to finasteride where they have a total loss of libido and it kills their mood and stuff like that.
And never comes back, right?
Well, fortunately for most men, if they stop the drug, the symptom goes away. But there is a small subset of men who appear to maybe be irreversibly damaged by that. Fortunately, that number seems to be very small. It's called post-finasteride syndrome, PFS, and it definitely is, it's a controversial topic in the urology literature, but it's another reason why I don't just recommend those drugs willy-nilly. I think I would want to make sure that if a guy's taking one of those drugs, he really kind of understands the potential risks of it. But there are other drawbacks to taking those drugs, right? So you can take that drug. Let's say you're in the majority of the cases of folks who they don't have that side effect, right? They don't have a post-finasteride syndrome or a finasteride syndrome. But now something else happens, which is you've artificially suppressed your PSA. So now one of the things we want to be, making sure of in an older man, or basically any man above 50 basically, is what's happening with respect to your risk for prostate cancer. Well, now I just took away one of my best screening tools. Now, it's not the end of the world if the doctor understands that, but most doctors don't know that when you put a man on finasteride or dutasteride, you have to be much more diligent about how you screen for prostate cancer, and you're looking for much smaller changes in PSA to cause alarm.
Very, very interesting. Going back to something that potentially is cringeworthy down the road or maybe is amazing. Do you know Brian Johnson and his Don't Die movement?
I know. I don't know him, but I've heard of it.
What do you think about that?
I don't have any thoughts on it.
So it's tied to AI, basically. So he's saying, hey, now is like the period you don't want to die, because if AI comes in and does what it's going to do, then we really might be able to find patterns in biology that right now are just completely invisible to us that will allow us to radically extend human life. So the question then really becomes about AI. Do you see anything in AI that you think is promising that could have a substantive impact on the way that we do health now, even if it's not to radically extend lifespan, but maybe radically extend health span or help us overcome diseases like cancer or whatever?
I mean, I would put myself in the camp of being very excited about AI, which is not a hard camp to be in today. I think most people are. I also think we're in an AI bubble. So I think where we are for AI right now is where the internet was in the late 90s.
Do you mean that as an investor though, or as in the ultimate promise?
Both. So absolutely as an investor, I think it's a totally overpriced bubble that's going to crash. But also in terms of expectation and timeline of expectation, right? So if you think back, and you're old enough as well to remember, in the mid 90s, as we were heading into the new millennium, I mean, people just thought the internet was going to change the world in ways that it hasn't quite. And yet there are ways in which it has changed the world that nobody could have predicted at the time. Let's take two obvious examples, Uber and Airbnb. Like nobody thought about that at the time, right? People thought about commerce, and that was a big deal. But it even took longer there for it to really become the profitable, disruptive technology it was. So look, I just think there's a parallel between how we think about AI and how we thought about the internet. I think AI will be more important than the internet. So I think when we're looking back in 50 years, I do believe, and I don't think I'm alone in believing this, I think AI will be an even bigger disruption, hopefully in a positive way than the internet was. But I think there are certain things that will take longer than we expect. So to your question, where do I think it's going to help? I think there's some really unsexy things it could do to help that, this would be a good time for people to go and get a snack or go take a leak. But like, if you think about healthcare, for example, like adjudication and reconciliation of healthcare billing is arguably the stupidest, most inane, part of this country, right? Like the amount of dollars that are wasted, the amount of brain damage that is inflicted on our species trying to reconcile medical payments and stuff like that it's impossible. And by the way, nobody knows how to do it. Like if I gave you an EOB, an explanation of benefits, and walked you through what was in there, you'd be like, dude, why don't you just talk to me in Japanese? Like I literally have no idea what you're talking about. Just tell me how much to pay. And oh, by the way, you're getting ripped off. So AI should solve that problem. Like we need to train AI to basically solve the entire system of how medication is adjudicated. I would love for AI to absolutely eviscerate PBMs, pharmacy benefit management entities. So these are the companies that live between the payers and the employers that are responsible for totally ripping off everybody in America.
Oh.
These are the biggest cancer in the healthcare system today. So if we could just eradicate that and actually have a pricing optimization run by an AI that is not skimming off literally tens of billions of dollars to itself, that would be incredible.
Wowza.
But none of those things are really going to help you live longer. So to the question of how we're going to live longer, probably the most exciting thing that AI has done at the moment, again, not that sexy if you don't understand the biology, but do you know how a protein works? Like the idea of what a protein is in the body?
Yes, but good Lord, as a person at a 80,000 foot view, not in any way mechanistic.
All right. So you eat a steak right now, right? So you're eating, and a steak is great because it has all the amino acids in it, all the essential amino acids. So you just ingested a whole bunch of protein that gets broken down into these building blocks called amino acids. There are 20 of them. When your body wants to make something, a lot of the things your body makes are proteins. They can be structural proteins like collagen, hair, muscle. They can be functional proteins like enzymes. Your DNA gets transcribed into RNA. That RNA gets turned into a signal to make a protein. And it strings together the amino acids. Now, by itself, that's not the protein. It has to undergo structural change and what's called post-translational modification. So sometimes it gets turned into a helix. Sometimes it gets turned into something that folds, and that's called the secondary structure of the protein. And ultimately it gets folded over onto itself into the most complicated three-dimensional structure you can ever imagine with thousands of amino acids. Okay. Until AI came along, we had absolutely no clue what the relationship was like between the string of amino acids and the final shape of the protein. And that is a big part of what made biotech really, really hard. So we could look at a receptor and say, man, I'd really love to have a drug that fits into that receptor and turns it on. I know the shape of the receptor, and I therefore know the shape of the thing that needs to fit in it. In other words, I have the keyhole, I can impute what the key is, but the key is a complicated structure, and I have to, from the key, impute what the 4,000 amino acids were that went into it. That had to be done by trial and error.
Woof.
Today, That is done with AI.
That's actively happening right now.
Yep.
Is this AlphaFold
Yep.
or, okay, how's that being used right now? Other than now we know, but how do we get that into?
We just completely, so it's basically changing pharma. It's basically changing drug discovery.
As we speak.
Yeah. Now, I want to be clear. Everybody said, oh my God, AlphaFold is going to make drug discovery take 1 year instead of 10. Not really. Because what they're forgetting is the long piece of this can't be done yet by AI, which is the clinical trials.
Yeah.
So it's totally shaving off all this time at the beginning and saving a ton of money. But the long pole in the tent of pharma is not the drug discovery, it's the clinical trials. You're still going to have to test this in humans in a very careful way that is, incremental. Like first, let's make sure it's safe. Okay, let's do a dose escalation. Okay, now let's make sure it kind of works. Okay, and it kind of works and it's kind of safe. Now let's do a bigger trial over a long enough period of time with enough people in it that if it really works and it's really safe, we're comfortable approving it. So all of that still has to happen. I'm sure AI will come up with ways to help make that better. But again, as nerdy as that example is, I mean, the folding pattern that's pretty freaking cool.
Yeah, that stuff is unbelievably cool. And this is one of those things, at the risk of me dragging people into my madness, this is why I'm so obsessed with game development. When you start doing game development, you realize that all of life is simply based on a set of rules. And once you know those rules, you can actually begin to predict what will happen. But the joy of being a human is you can't predict all of the things that are going to happen. And so now as you create a virtual world, you can set up these rules that are so complex and interact in these really fascinating ways that you effectively, and I don't think people are going to like this sentence, but you effectively get to play God. So as a developer, you get to play God because you're creating the set of rules. But as somebody exploring those worlds, imagine creating a world that is based on a set of rules, and it will spawn literally an infinite number of worlds. And you can have a world that is an entire universe unto itself that you will get to explore uniquely. Nobody else will ever encounter that world unless you want them to. And once you understand that the sophistication with which you can create these virtual worlds is tied to what the AI can predict in our world. So now in the future, you'll be able to apply AI like AlphaFold to a virtual world where it's building up from amino acid building blocks, but creating creatures in your world that are like built literally down at that level.
Yeah.
And so it becomes fascinating.
I mean, obviously this is an incredible topic to explore. It's one for which, so let's take a step back so people can kind of understand the complexity of the problem. I know you understand this, but I think it's important for the listeners to understand. We're about 25 years out from the sequencing of the human genome, right?
Yep.
So Human Genome Project was completed, I think about the year 2000. And that was heralded as the single most important breakthrough in all of human health. But it hasn't really panned out. In other words, that didn't come close to being as helpful to human health as the discovery of insulin, penicillin, sterile technique, sanitation. Like, the elucidation of the human genome has saved fewer lives in the last 25 years than 10 minutes of what sanitation, antibiotics, and insulin have saved since we've been talking. Okay. So why is that? Well, it's because of something you sort of alluded to, but I'm going to twist it and make it my words. The rule book doesn't transmit. So what we coded was the human genotype. There are 3 billion base pairs that define you and define me. By the way, the only difference between you and me is a couple percent. So we're virtually identical genetically. But obviously, if you look at us, we look nothing alike. I mean, we both have 2 eyes. We stand on our feet. Like you can recognize that we're of the same species. Right. We otherwise look quite different. So what we have no clue of, for the most part, is the relationship between the genotype and the phenotype. It's why we can't go and make something genetically. So as an example, let's assume that I had all the control to manipulate the genome that I wanted, which I don't, by the way. But let's assume CRISPR was so perfect that I could, and it is, by the way, CRISPR is probably at this point good enough that we can change any gene. What we can't do is insert it. So we're good at developing payloads. We still have horrible delivery systems. But let's assume all that's done. Let's assume I can make any gene of any size, edit any gene of any size, and deliver it to your entire genome if I want to. That's a big if. Not clear that's ever going to happen, but let's grant that it's going to happen. If you said, Peter, I want to be smarter. Can you genetically manipulate me to be smarter? We would say, we don't have the foggiest clue what genes are responsible for being smart. Okay, can you make me taller? Never mind me, my growth plates are fused. Can you make my kid taller? No, we have no clue what genes, right? We wouldn't even know what genes to adjust the eye color of your offspring. Think of how trivial these things are. And we do not understand the relationship between genotype and phenotype. And so it just speaks to how complex this problem is. Now, is AI going to help us on that front? I sure as hell hope so. But if we don't have that, we don't even have a prayer of basically doing AI clinical trials. But here's the other thing. Genotype is only part of the equation. It's also adaptation. So it's the whole nurture-nature problem. So why is it that you could take 3 genetically identical embryos and put them in 3 totally different environments, and they're going to end up producing 3 pretty different people that, by the way, might respond different to 3 different drugs? And why is that? Well, it's differential gene expression. This is now getting into what's called the epigenome. And you could say, well, Peter, can't we figure out that? Okay, maybe, but like it's getting awfully complicated. So look, the beauty of futurism is it makes us all look stupid because all the stuff we sit here and think is going to happen, we can't imagine the things that are going to happen. But my intuition is that there are lots of really incredible ways that AI is going to make what I do so much better, but they're not as like wham bam super sexy as maybe people would like to believe, at least not in the foreseeable future.
Do you use AI right now?
Yes, use it quite a bit. Definitely still kind of struggling with some of it. Like I think honestly, it's just, I would describe AI right now as a really unhelpful analyst. Like it's an analyst, it functions as an analyst, but it's like the fastest working, fastest reading, least intelligent analyst I have. Like there's some value to that, right? Amazing at spitting out a first draft of thought, but like, we have 5 research analysts on our team. Like they're all here. GPT-4 is like way down here.
Right. Yeah.
For the type of work we do. Obviously GPT-4 is way above all of us in certain areas.
Sure.
For the type of work we do, it's borderline a moron.
I will be very surprised if in, call it 3 years, that for an analyst position, that it's not able to match or surpass the brightest that you have. That's purely
it's going to come down to the
based on
training set. So for certain things it already does. Like, I could argue maybe for coding and things like that where the training set is so high it has. The real challenge of the work we do, it's very difficult to train an AI on.
Why?
Because it just hasn't been done. Like we could do it, but like we'd have to quit our jobs and just work on training the AI. So nobody's out there, to my knowledge, who's trying to train an AI to do what we do, which is how do you critically read papers? And, how do you read 10 papers on a subject matter, go and read all the references, be critical of which studies suck, which ones are good, what the limitations and strengths are of each paper, and all of that stuff. I mean, what AI could do, if AI could do that, it could clearly write better than us. It could clearly write faster than us. It's going to take a while for us to train it how to think. And it's not been from a lack of trying on our end. Like I really push GPT-4 to try to get smarter on stuff that I want it to do. I jam a lot of papers into it, and It's great at summarizing. It's just not a synthesizer. It's just not smart in that regard.
Yeah, I'll be very interested to see if as the cost of compute goes down, which that's a huge question mark, whether we're going to run out of compute or not. But let's say that the cost of compute goes down, you get more people training models. If you're able to reduce the amount of data that the models need to be trained, which it seems like they will be able to, now all of a sudden put it in the hands of a team like yours and thousands, maybe tens of thousands of other teams out there. I think it'll be really interesting, even if it only gets more efficient at the level of model training. We could see some pretty big breakthroughs because now you have a lot of people training these, and depending on whether they get made proprietary or open source, there's just so much benefit to humankind. Obviously, if we can begin to recognize patterns. I mean, that anything where it really seems obvious that this is a pattern recognition game, to me, it is only a matter of time before AI will be able to do it.
For sure.
Things that aren't pure pattern recognition, okay, and maybe some of what you're doing isn't just pattern recognition, and so there becomes a judgment thing. I don't know. I don't know the level of data that would be required for the genome type, I forget how you said that, to the phenotype, that translation, like if we were to get everybody, billions of people, would that be enough for AI to
that
begin?
would be awesome. So if you had the genome, if you had the 3 billion base pairs of every one of the 8 billion of us on this planet, and you could code the phenotype, that's what you have to be able to do.
Right.
So how are you going to quantify and code phenotype? So what would we do for you? Height, weight, skin tone, eye color, IQ, like what are the parameters we're going to put in there? I don't know. Like we'd want to be able to put hundreds of thousands parameters in there. We don't know how to what can we measure and quantify to put in there? Vertical jump. Well, I don't know. How do I know your vertical jump is what it is because you hurt your knee 10 years ago versus what your genetic capability was? Right. So this is the problem.
Yeah. Look, heard, and that for sure is going to be a limiting factor. But when I think about this on longer timelines, a lot of this goes away. But when I also think about
if you could do this prospectively, right? So if starting today, every kid that was born, you took their genome and you could map some quantity of their phenotype. We came up with like the 50 to 100 metrics we wanted, and we just tracked everybody serially over time. I mean, sure, you could produce something really remarkable.
No doubt. And then also, I think we're kicking off so much data now. If we were aggregating all of that data, to your point, you're not going to have everything that we will ever care about. But you certainly would be able to get things like sleep data. So this person, how do they respond to sleep? How do they respond to stress? Heart rate variability. There are so many things that we kick off now. It's not going to, it's going to be less than probably 1% of the things that we will ultimately care about. But you can really begin to zoom in on things, especially again over time. So it's like, all right, if you're tracking what a kid's doing from whatever age 13, even if you start clocking them at 18, and you collect data on them for 20 years, including things like that you would get in a census. So how much money do they end up making? Now all of a sudden, and I'm not even saying this doesn't lead to something dystopian, but you'll be able to figure out a lot of these things in their genotype are coded to these outcomes, or we see patterns in these outcomes.
But then it begs the question, to what end?
Yeah. I will answer that question. And this comes down to, I think society ends up bifurcating. This is, again, where we get into my personal hobby horses here. But I think society bifurcates. There are going to be people that don't want anything to do with this. And then there are going to be people that break on the technological side. And now all of a sudden you are quite literally crafting superhuman people.
And how do we bifurcate this society? Is it a geographic bifurcation?
Ooh. So yes, I think this is where I break company with Bilyeu, who I think you know. Oh, you don't know Bilyeu Srinivasan? Oh my God, two people who I think would find each other fascinating. So Bilyeu has a whole thesis that we're going to break into what he calls network states, where you won't be geographically bound. You're going to be bound by effectively ideology, and that you'll see a weakening of governments as money decentralizes, Anyway, I don't think humans are wired like that. I think ultimately we respond most strongly to the people that we're around. And I think we respond very negatively to over isolation. And it does not yet seem that the connections that you get online can replicate the things you need in your real life. So I have a feeling that unless we overcome that, you're not going to see that play out. What you will see is a further segregating by geography. Now, how big that geography will have to be, is it city versus rural? Probably. That seems like the sort of play throughout human history, is that you see people aggregating in cities and they think about the world very differently than people that aggregate out in rural areas. So my gut instinct will be that you'll get something like the Amish. And in my mind, I always clock them as Puritans, people who literally use the word, I am a Puritan. My body is pure. I do not put technology in my body. I do not interface with AI. And so they'll break somewhere along the 90s, effectively, is how I think about it. They'll want technology. They're not going to want to go too far backwards, but they will go to the 90s and say, okay, this is a state of technology that is useful.
Meaning they'll go back from here.
They will go back from here.
They'll regress from where
Correct. Just like we're going to stop letting kids have social media before they're 16. That'll probably end up being a little bit later. Again, these are factions. This won't be universal. But I think parents are waking up to the fact that it is parental malpractice to let your kid suffer the psychological consequences of having social media too early. More and more studies will come out. It'll just be impossible to ignore. It'll start getting mandated. You'll start seeing people really embrace that. As literally Elon Musk continues to do brain-computer interfaces, it won't be long, 15 years, before you've got people that legitimately are getting upgrades. There's nothing wrong with them. They just want a brain implant because it allows them to see in infrared or whatever. And so you're going to start seeing people do that. And you will get people that respond violently to that. This is not what God intended. It will break in very similar ways to religion. You're already seeing a geographic segregation based on right and left, which I worry about that. When you start like in the next 3 years, probably not. In the next 30 years, yes. Like this stuff is going to get exacerbated. So I think we have enough things with modern technology that is both outlandishly amazing, and so will attract people like me, and really detrimental. And people are going to respond and they're going to go down that path. So anyway, I think anything extreme like this is going to push people farther and farther into those two camps. So yeah, I think the ultimate segregation will be geographic, but this comes down to ideology, how far people embrace AI being the most important.
Yeah, an interesting thesis.
It is going to get fascinating. That is for sure. All right. As you look at some of the things that are right now today in terms of positive, negative. So modern ills, overfeeding being, I think, maybe the most profound, but I have Ozempic. Why can I drug my way out of this? Can I pour more modernity on modernity and solve the problems?
It looks like you can. I mean, it really looks like and remember, Ozempic is just sort of the first effective group of those drugs. So the GLP-1s have been around for a decade, and they've been largely ineffective for weight management. In fact, they were never brought on as weight management drugs. They're brought on as drugs for improving insulin sensitivity. But something about semaglutide as Ozempic was the first time when it was like, oh my God, like all these people with diabetes, their diabetes is getting better, but they're losing an unbelievable amount of weight. And so that realization happened 4 years ago. And now we've got a second drug that's even better than Ozempic, called tirzepatide, or Wegovy, or Mounjaro, and it's even more effective, right? Wow. Fewer side effects, even more effective. And then we've got another one that's not approved yet, but it's in phase 3 called retatrutide that is even more potent than both of these, with no more side effects. So if you actually go down the list of all of these drugs out there, there's 30 more of them in the pipeline. So we have no shortage of drugs coming at us that are going to help people eat less. And now a number of these drugs are also being targeted at reversing sarcopenia. So it's not just how do I eat less, it's how do I preserve more muscle. Now, the challenge is we still don't know if these drugs preserve strength. And right now, the early versions of these drugs appear to increase muscle mass, but not strength. So it doesn't appear to be a functional gain.
They
And that,
actively increase muscle mass?
yeah, so there's one drug called Bema that actually increases muscle mass, even in the setting of using semaglutide, which decreases muscle mass, all things equal, because you're losing muscle mass and fat mass. You're getting leaner, by the way. So it's decreasing fat mass at 3 times the rate it's decreasing muscle mass. So you're still,
Whoa.
you're getting, your body composition is improving. So, that begs the question that you might not have a complete pharmacologic ill to training. Like you still have to train. It seems that, at least based on what we know today, the only way to actually get stronger is to put the muscle under stress. It's not enough to just take a drug that increases the size of the muscle or prevents the muscle from shrinking. That shouldn't be that surprising, right? Like, it's hard to imagine that there was going to be a hack around getting stronger. But it really seems that these drugs have done something that no other class of drugs have ever done before, which is to be simultaneously reasonably safe. I say reasonably because I don't think we know enough yet to know that they are completely safe. And I don't really know what completely safe means. I don't think there's a single drug that is completely safe. Like Tylenol, Advil, and aspirin are not completely safe. So, with any drug, there's going to be a side effect. But when I say reasonably safe, I mean, it does not appear to be the case that these drugs are causing cancer or pulmonary hypertension or, some sort of irreversible damage in the brain or something like that, where we certainly had concerns with previous drugs that had really good efficacy for weight loss, like fen-phen, but they were, killing people eventually. So you have this drug that's safe and effective, and that's a first. We just haven't had that in the weight space. There are a lot of things that are being touted about GLP-1 agonists as like panaceas for all sorts of conditions, but we did a pretty thorough review on this, and most of the evidence that these things have benefit for, heart disease, kidney disease, dementia, seem more related to the fact that you're losing weight and you're getting more metabolically healthy, because these drugs are not just weight loss drugs. What they're also doing to people is really increasing their insulin sensitivity. So with those two things happening, it doesn't surprise me that people are having less sleep apnea, fewer heart attacks, less kidney disease, less hypertension, less cancer. I think we'll see all of those things happen. But it begs the question, would you get those same benefits if you used sleep, nutrition, and exercise to achieve the same spot? And the answer is probably, but how many people can do that without the assistance of these drugs? That says nothing of the cost of these drugs. We can get into a much lengthier discussion about, if we truly wanted to put every person who's overweight on this country on one of those drugs, the healthcare system can't support that. And what's the trade-off of the cost of doing that versus the cost of letting those chronic diseases come to roost 20 years down the line? So there's a whole bunch of really complicated economic and sort of social questions around this. But I think the more important question really comes down to, what's the safety profile? What's the efficacy profile?
Wow, I did not realize that there were that many more coming out. I had a very negative view of Ozempic. I would have told people, hey, stay away from it. There are going to be consequences that we can't anticipate. Listening to that description, maybe I heard what I wanted to hear, but it sounds like I've got something that's like a steroid that I'll have to lift, because if I want to get strong, and I do, I still have to put in the energy. But if I've got something that's helping me get leaner while adding muscle mass, which is the holy grail, as long as I take care of making sure the muscle mass can actually contract hard and lift heavy things and lower heavy things, I'm pretty excited about that.
Yeah, although I don't see how you're going to need to take one of these drugs. I mean, you're already pretty lean. I think.
But I'm probably 12% body fat. Let's say.
Why would you want to be leaner?
Is that a joke?
No.
Have you seen Fight Club? Peter, I could look better. I'll tell you that. I look good. I don't look bad. I get comments from my wife. I'll be the first to admit. But I've been leaner, and when you're really lean, it looks good.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly think the sweet spot is probably 10 to 14% for a male. So if you're at
shut your mouth, Peter. Attia.
Well, again, we're not optimizing for how we look. We should be optimizing for how we perform and how our body functions.
Yes.
Yeah. If we're talking about peak physical performance, if you're trying to win the Tour de France by all means, you're going to need to be leaner. If you're trying to, win a bodybuilding competition, of course, you're going to need to be leaner. But there are probably consequences of walking around at 6% body fat for prolonged periods of time.
Yeah. More attention from the opposite sex, feeling better naked. Yes, terrible consequences, Peter. No, I'm sure you're right. Unfortunately,
I'm just a fat guy rationalizing his
there
existence.
it is. That's I was thinking that your obesity is making me very uncomfortable, Peter, right now. Dude, tell me about David.
So super exciting. Basically, for folks not knowing what we're talking about David, the protein bar that I'm involved with. Yeah, no offense, I've never really liked protein bars.
Shame on you.
I know.
As the founder of Quest,
I know.
wounded.
I'm sorry. I've never really been able to find a protein bar that I could eat consistently. So most of my supplementary protein has had to come in two forms, shakes and jerky. And the good news is both of those things are so much better today than they were 10 years ago. I mean, you and I are OGs. Like, we were the guys drinking protein shakes 40 years ago when they were hideous. But in the past 5 or 6 years, I think the ability to just get incredibly good tasting, highly dissolvable whey isolate is like, we're done. Like, that problem's been solved. It's now a commodity product. Similarly, on the salty solid side of things, to be able to like eat my Maui Nui venison jerky, carnivore crisps, those things like that, like, just incredible. But there's been this void of how do I have something that is sweet, solid, high in protein, low in calories. And so entered this bar, which was primarily developed by a guy named Peter Rahal, who's the founder of a company called RX Bar that you're probably familiar with. They made a kind of a paleo bar. He went off, sold that bar a few years ago to Kellogg's, I believe. And then I think after he read Outlive, kind of came to this idea that if we can maximize protein and minimize calories, that's kind of an ideal spot for snacks. Kind of realized that there was a big impediment to doing that. Protein bars, I mean, you know this very well. You know this better than I do. Protein bars are hard to make.
Yes, they
Protein is an awful nutrient to manipulate. Carbohydrates and fat are pretty easy to manipulate. Protein is awful. It tastes horrible. It's very chalky. It's difficult to bind to. There's nothing about protein that is meant to exist in the state that we do it this way, right? Like, protein really should just be consumed in its natural state. You should eat eggs, you should eat fish, you should eat meat, you should consume dairy. Like, those are the best sources of protein. And so how do you get a PDCAS of 1, meaning a perfect protein digestibility and absorption score, in something that's manufactured using things like whey? You need a really good binding system and you need a really good fat system. And so that's kind of the technology that went into making David, to sort of, we wanted to have this bar that was basically going to be able to get 75% of its calories coming from protein. Which, to put that on perspective with other foods, like, that's what you would get in a cooked chicken breast, right? You're getting 75% of the calories from protein.
It's incredible, man.
Not as good as cod. I will admit, cod is closer to 86%. So,
but for something that tastes like cookie dough,
it's
a big leap over cod. Well, as the elder statesman in the room when it comes to protein bars, I will say move fast and build that moat, man, because whatever problem you have solved, people will come for you.
I bet.
But it is very exciting. I love you guys picking up the torch and running with it and creating something new.
I mean, you're one of the few people who probably has a better understanding of this. I mean, the list of people who know this industry as well as you do is probably a one-hand industry. So,
yeah, no doubt. It's exciting, man. Where can people follow along with you?
Well, probably on Instagram and YouTube, which are it's all Peter Attia, MD, and on our site where they can sign up for an awesome newsletter.
Nice. I will say subscribe to everything that you do in terms of the Q&As and stuff that you do, the video content is amazing. Every time you sit across from me, I make sure that I spend hours and hours and hours with your content. It is extraordinary, and I am not incentivized in any way, shape, or form to tell people that. It's just because I really believe that's true. So I hope people will do that.
Appreciate that very much.
And speaking of things that I hope people do, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe. And until next time, my friends, be legendary. Take care. Peace. If you like this conversation, check out this episode to learn more.
Then what you realize is your capacity to tap into dopamine as a motivator, not just seeking dopamine rewards, that is infinite. And I can say with great certainty that this is how you were able to build a big company and sell it, how you've been able to build a successful podcast and sell it.